When we're looking at managed print or office printing in general, I think companies really don't understand what their costs are and how to control cost. When we're looking at office printing cost, there's sort of three categories that I look at. There's hard cost, soft cost. There's another cost that companies really don't look at, and this hits on the security piece, and that's the cost of mitigating risk. When I talk about hard costs, we're talking about the cost of the actual cost of the hardware supplies and the service or maintenance to service that hardware. When we're looking at soft costs, that mostly deals with time, like time spent with internal IT people repairing devices, going out and maybe installing print drivers at an employee's desk or other type of print-related tasks that the IT is involved in. There's also time spent paying multiple invoices or managing multiple contracts. You've also got other soft costs with like over-purchasing toner or toner sitting in, an office supply closet, or a lot of times you see, stacks of toner sitting under employees' desk or on their desk. And you've just got that cost sitting around, which it's costing you money just to have that money tied up. So those are really two of the major costs. But then you talk about the cost of mitigating risk, and that's really like what level of security is needed. So if we're talking about a school district that may not need very high level of security on a lot of their documents, out in, if a teacher's printing, just day-to-day stuff for their classroom, that may not need a high level of security. But if a counselor's printing sensitive information, that may need a little bit more higher level of security needed to make sure that sensitive information's not shared with people that don't have authorized access to see that information. Of course, if you're talking about financial organizations or healthcare organizations, they have a lot higher risk in sensitive information, so their risk would be much higher. And so those types of companies really have to think about what it's going to cost them if that information is exposed some way. If we're looking at hard costs, hardware-related hard costs, I think the number one thing there is consolidating devices where appropriate. So what I mean by that is, a lot of times you'll see, say, a color printer, a copier, or an MFP and a fax all sitting, lined up right next to each other. I mean, all those devices could be consolidated into one device. Or, I've seen in financial institutions where you've got different cost centers and you've got two printers sitting right next to each other that are the exact same model printer, but they belong to two different cost centers that came out of two different budgets. And so you could consolidate those devices and then use some software to bill back those prints to the appropriate cost centers. So consolidating devices would be one for reducing hard costs. Looking at supplies, one thing I talked about earlier is right-sizing devices. So, making sure that the device and volumes match up and that the device is efficient for the amount of volume that's being run on it. And then as far as toner, implementing an automatic toner fulfillment would be, the best way, I think, to reduce cost there so that you're not having toner sent around, you're not overspending on purchasing toner, is that the toner's arriving when you need it, and you're only paying for that toner as it arrives for that device. When we look at service costs and controlling those costs, I think having new, up-to-date, reliable, modern devices help. If you've got old devices, as I talked about earlier, that are broken a lot and you're having to either call somebody to service them, or you're having your internal IT go out and having to service those, and you're ordering and having to wait on parts, if you have a refresh cycle. say you've got a 3-year refresh cycle where you're going to refresh, your devices, and that way you always have new reliable devices in place. Another thing is, outsourcing the break fix services to a reliable third party. Nowadays, I don't think organizations really don't want to be hiring break fix technicians to be working on printers. They want to be hiring IT staff to be working on solutions to business problems and not worry about fixing hardware. So that money would be better used to outsource to, a company that specializes in break fix services or printers and copiers, MFPs. When looking at soft calls, I think consolidating the numbers of vendors and contracts that you're working with. So the fewer vendors and the fewer contracts that you have to work with, that's going to really lower the amount of time spent by accounts payable, and then the finance department having to deal with those vendors and contracts, as well as the time spent that your IT staff may be having to spend with vendors. And so if you've got just one, maybe two vendors that you're dealing with and just as few as contracts as possible for your office printing, that's going to really lower your costs, your soft costs there. Lastly, when we're talking about mitigating risk, and this is going to be different really for the individual companies, like I pointed out earlier, schools are going to be different from banks or financial institutions, different than hospitals. You've just really got to understand what the possible threats are, and then you've got to understand what the likelihood of a potential loss would be, and the size of that loss in case there's a breach in security. And then, just determining what level of security that you're going to implement for your office printing. So, really, when we're talking about costs, there's really two benefits or outcomes from that, and that's really, reduce your printing expenses. So if you implement a lot of things that I talked about, you should see your printing expenses go down. Of course, I'm talking about mitigating risk, there's a trade-off. If you have to implement a lot of security measures, that's going to possibly increase some of your costs, but it could possibly save you a lot of money, prevent you from having to spend a lot of money down the road if you do have a breach. So that's one thing that you have to consider, that level of risk there. And another big thing, I think, which is really possibly more important than reducing your printing expenses, and that's having a predictable budget. And, if you know what you're going to be spending on your office print every month, you can predict that out into the future. And understanding that will help you, set your budgets and really know where you need to be with your office printing.